I had lived alone on this farm for 7 years, and I had grown used to the silence. It was not the kind of silence that pressed down on a man, but the steady, ordinary kind that came with wind moving through empty fields and the occasional lowing of cattle. I was 33. My parents had died when I was 26, and the land they left me was all I had. 60 acres on the slope they called Greywind Hill, though only half of it was worth planting. The house was 2 rooms, timber and stone, with a roof that needed patching every autumn and a floor of packed earth that never quite stayed level. I did not write to the marriage broker because I was lonely in the way poets describe. I wrote because the work was too much for one man. The animals still needed feeding when I was mending fences. The garden still needed tending when I was hauling water. I needed someone who could cook without burning the bread every other day, someone who could salt meat properly and keep the hens alive through winter. I needed a wife for the same reason a man needs a second pair of hands when the snow comes early. In the letter I sent, I described the farm as stable and the house as comfortable. I said the life here was quiet and steady. All of that was true in a narrow sense. The farm fed me. The house kept the rain off my head, but I left out the part where the wind came through the gaps in the walls in winter, and the part where the nearest proper village was half a day's ride, and most of the people there had already decided I was the strange one who kept to himself. I did not lie outright. I simply let the truth wear better clothes than it owned. The reply came on a Thursday, carried by the same rider who brought salt and news from the lowlands. The letter was written in a careful hand. The woman who sent it was called Melra Thornbloom. She wrote that she knew how to keep a house, how to cook, how to mend and preserve. She said she was willing to come to the border if the terms were fair. There was no poetry in her words, no promises of affection. That suited me. I had no poetry to offer in return. I answered her the same week. We exchanged 3 more letters after that. In each one I tried to be clearer about what the farm actually was, but I never quite managed to say the roof leaked or that the hens were more trouble than they were worth. She never asked for more than I gave. Perhaps she was doing the same thing I was, writing the version of herself that seemed most likely to be accepted. She arrived on the last day of autumn, when the leaves had already turned and the first hard frost had touched the grass. I waited by the track that ran past the lower pasture. The cart that brought her was old but well kept, pulled by a single sturdy horse. When she stepped down, I saw at once that she had dressed for a different kind of arrival than the one she was receiving. She wore a dark green cloak with silver edging at the hem, and gloves that had been embroidered along the cuffs. Her hair was braided and pinned in a way that suggested she had spent time on it that morning. She was tall, even for an orc, and the way she carried herself made the smallness of everything around her more obvious. She looked at the track, at the leaning fence, at the 3 dark shapes of cattle in the far field, and then at the house itself. Her eyes moved over the roof, the single chimney, the small porch that sagged on one side. She did not speak at first. She simply stood there with her trunk at her feet, and the wind pulling at the edge of her cloak. I walked forward. "You made good time," I said. She turned her head toward me. Her face was composed, but I saw the quick flicker of assessment in her eyes as she took in my worn coat and the mud on my boots. "This is the farm," she said. It was not quite a question. "It is." She looked past me again, toward the horizon where the hills rose and the trees grew thicker. "The town," she said after a moment. "You wrote that it was near." I nodded toward the east. "We passed it on the way here, 3 houses and the smithy." For the space of several breaths, she said nothing. Then she drew in a slow breath and let it out. "I see." I picked up her trunk. It was heavier than I expected. She followed me without comment. When we reached the house, I set the trunk down inside the main room and stepped back so she could look around. The fire was lit. I had swept the floor that morning and put fresh water in the pitcher. It was the best the place could look, and it still looked small. She stood just inside the doorway for a long time. Her gaze moved across the table, the 2 chairs, the narrow bed against the far wall, the shelf that held my few plates and cups. She did not frown. She did not smile. She simply looked, and I felt the weight of everything I had not written in my letters settle between us. "You said the house was comfortable," she said at last. I rubbed the back of my neck. "It keeps the weather out." She turned her head slightly, as if weighing whether to say more. In the end, she only nodded once and stepped further inside. That first evening I showed her where the woodpile was and how the pump worked. She listened, without interrupting. When I asked if she wanted to rest, she said she would rather see the kitchen. I showed her the stove, the small pantry, the hooks where I hung the pots. She ran one gloved finger along the edge of the stove and said nothing about the soot or the way one of the legs had been propped with a wedge of wood. I left her to settle her things and went out to check the animals. When I came back, the light was fading. She had started a fire in the stove and set water to boil. There was flour on the table and a bowl she must have found in the cupboard. I watched her work for a moment from the doorway. She moved carefully, as if the kitchen were a place she had studied but never quite entered. Dinner was bread that had not risen properly in the middle, soup that was saltier than any soup needed to be, and a pot of grain that had burned at the bottom while the top remained half-cooked. She served it without apology. I ate what was in front of me. The bread was dense. The soup made my tongue feel thick. I drank water between bites and did not comment on any of it. She sat across from me and ate very little. Her posture remained straight, but her eyes stayed on her bowl more than on me. When the meal was finished, I stood and gathered the plates. She started to rise as well, but I shook my head. "I'll wash them," I said. She sat back down. For a while, the only sounds were the scrape of the brush against the tin plates and the low crack of the fire. I kept my back to her. I did not know what to say that would not make the evening worse than it already was. Later, after the lamps were out and I had banked the fire, I lay on my side of the room and listened to the wind moving around the corners of the house. I heard her moving quietly on the other side of the curtain I had hung for her privacy. Then the sound stopped. I thought she had gone to sleep. Sometime deep in the night I woke to another sound. It was soft, almost lost beneath the wind, but I recognized it for what it was. She was outside, on the small porch. I could hear the faint, steady rhythm of someone trying very hard not to be heard while they wept. I lay still. I did not get up. I did not call out to her. I told myself it was because she would not want to be seen. But the truth was simpler. I had no comfort to offer that would not sound like an excuse. I had brought her with a picture of the farm that was kinder than the reality, and she had come with skills she did not actually possess. We had both arrived carrying more hope than either of us had admitted on paper. Outside, the wind kept moving. Inside, the house was quiet except for the small, private sound of her crying. I closed my eyes and listened until it faded. Then I turned toward the wall and waited for morning. The morning after the night I heard her crying, I woke to the sound of wood being stacked in the stove. For a moment I lay still, listening. She moved quietly, but not with the hesitation of someone unsure of her place. When I pushed the curtain aside, she was already there, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of cloth. On the table she had set out flour, a bowl of water, salt, and the small knife I use for cutting bread. She looked up when she heard me. Her eyes were clear, though the skin beneath them was faintly darkened from lack of sleep. "Teach me how to make bread," she said. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure I had heard her correctly. "You want to learn now?" "Yes." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I do not know how, but I remember what I am shown. If you tell me once, I will not need to be told again." I crossed the room and looked at what she had gathered. It was not much, but it was everything required. She had even found the jar of starter I kept in the cool corner. "All right," I said. I showed her how to check the fire first, how to use the driest kindling so the heat would come steady and not smoke the room. She watched without interrupting. When I handed her the poker, she took it and adjusted the logs exactly as I had done. Then I measured the flour into the bowl and showed her how much water to add, not too much at once, how to bring it together with her fingers before it became a proper dough. She worked slowly at first, testing the feel of it. When the dough was too wet, she looked at me without speaking. I nodded toward the flour. She added a little more and tried again. By the time the sun had fully cleared the hills, the first loaves were shaped and set to rise on the shelf above the stove. While we waited, I showed her the pump and how to fill the kettle without wasting water. She listened, asked one question about the handle that sometimes stuck, then tried it herself until it moved smoothly. Later, when the bread went into the oven, I showed her how to listen for the sound of the crust forming, how not to open the door too soon. She did not burn the first batch. It was dense in the middle and the crust was uneven, but it was bread. We ate it with the last of the cheese and the soup left from the night before. She did not apologize for the previous evening's meal. She simply watched how I broke the bread and copied the motion. Over the next days, the lessons continued. I showed her how to keep the soup from boiling too hard so the vegetables would not turn to mush. I showed her how much salt was enough and how the same amount could ruin a pot if added all at once. She never argued. When something went wrong, she asked what had caused it and tried again the next time. Her hands, which had been smooth when she arrived, began to show the work. Small blisters formed where she gripped the knife and the handle of the heavy pot. One morning I saw her wrap a strip of cloth around her palm before she reached for the kettle. I stopped her. "Let me see." She hesitated, then held her hand out. The skin had split across the base of 2 fingers. I fetched the small tin of salve I kept for cuts and rubbed it in carefully. She watched my hands rather than my face. "You do not have to do this," she said. "You will work slower if it keeps splitting." She was quiet for a moment. In my father's house, there were servants for the kitchen. I was never expected to learn these things. My sisters married men who already had households. I was the 3rd daughter. After the last war, there was little left to divide, no dowry for me, no one asked for my hand. I kept working the salve into her skin. "So, you answered the letter instead." I answered because I did not want to remain in a house where I was only another mouth to feed. I thought if I could be useful somewhere, even far from everything I knew, it would be better than staying. She pulled her hand back gently when I finished. "I am not afraid of work, only of being useless." The day settled into a pattern after that. She rose before I did and had the fire going. I showed her how to feed the hens without scattering grain where the mice would find it, how to check the goats for signs of illness, how to turn the salt meat in the barrel so it cured evenly. She learned the names of the tools and where each one belonged. When something broke, she brought it to me and asked how it was mended rather than waiting for me to notice. In the evenings, after the animals were settled and the lamps lit, she sometimes opened the small book she had carried in her trunk. It was bound in worn leather, the pages thin from use. She read from it in a low voice, not loudly, as if the words were meant for the room rather than for an audience. The language was Orcish at first, then she would translate pieces into Common so I could follow. The poems were old, about mountains that remembered names and rivers that carried stories longer than any clan. I had never thought of words being used that way. Writing to me had always been for marking debts or noting the day the first frost touched the fields. One night, after she closed the book, I asked what the title meant. She told me it was called The Stones That Speak. Her grandmother had given it to her when she was small. She had carried it through every house she had lived in since. I thought about that for several days. Then, on a morning when the rain kept us inside, I went to the small shed behind the house and found the pieces of pine I had been saving for fence rails. I was not a carpenter, but I could measure and cut straight enough. I made a simple frame, 4 legs and 2 shelves, and nailed it together with what I had. It leaned a little to the left when I set it against the wall, and one of the nails sat proud of the wood. I carried it inside and placed it near the window where the light was best. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she set her book on the top shelf, exactly in the center, and stepped back to see how it looked. "It is the first thing anyone has ever given me that was made for what I love," she said. I rubbed the back of my neck, suddenly aware of every uneven edge. "It is not very fine." "It is mine," she answered. "That is fine enough." By the end of the 3rd month, the house had changed in small ways I had not planned. The floor was swept more often, the plates were stacked in the same order every evening. When I came in from the fields, there was usually something warm on the stove and a lamp already lit. She no longer asked where everything was kept. She simply moved through the rooms as if she had always known their shape. We did not speak of the letters we had written. We did not speak of the night she had cried on the porch. But when she read in the evenings, her voice had lost the careful distance it had carried at first. And when I listened, I found myself hearing more than the words. I heard the steadiness of someone who had decided to stay. One afternoon, while she was turning the soil in the small garden plot I had shown her, I watched from the doorway. Her sleeves were rolled high, her hair had come loose at the temples, and there was dirt on her cheek. She looked nothing like the woman who had stepped down from the cart in the embroidered gloves. She looked like someone who belonged to the work. I realized then that I had stopped waiting for her to leave. Somewhere between the burned bread and the crooked shelf, between the lessons given and the ones received, the shape of the days had become something we both carried. We had not yet given it a name. We only knew that neither of us was any longer alone inside it. The cold came early that year. It swept down from the north in long, steady waves, turning the grass white and stiffening the ground until the spade rang against it like iron. I spent my days checking the cattle twice, hauling extra hay into the barn and making sure the water troughs did not freeze solid. Maelra took the inside work without being asked. She banked the fire higher each evening, dried the washing closer to the stove, and began moving through the small pantry with the same quiet purpose she used in the kitchen. She did not complain about the cold. Instead, she set about changing what she could. One morning, I came in from the barn to find her standing on a stool, pressing strips of old paper against the gaps between the wall planks. She had boiled flour and water into a thin paste and was using it to seal the worst of the drafts. The paper was yellowed and torn at the edges, but when she finished, the room felt smaller and quieter at the same time. "You will run out of paper before the winter ends," I said. She stepped down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Then I will use cloth next. There is enough in the trunk." She also hung a heavy wool blanket across the doorway so the wind would not rush in every time the door opened. At night, she rearranged the burls in the pantry so the mice could not reach the grain as easily. One afternoon, I found her sitting by the window with one of my old coats across her lap, needle moving steadily through a tear in the sleeve. She had already mended 3 shirts and both pairs of my work trousers without saying a word about it. The house began to feel different, not larger but less empty. When I came back from the fields at dusk, there was usually a lamp already burning on the table and something warm waiting on the stove. She would look up from whatever she was doing and ask, in that same steady voice, whether the brown cow's limp had improved, or if the fence along the lower pasture still needed mending. Small questions, the kind that made the day feel shared rather than simply endured. One night, after the lamps were lit and the wind was pushing hard against the walls, she closed her book and set it on the shelf I had made. She sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long moment before she spoke. "Are you disappointed that I am not the woman you expected from the letters?" I looked at her across the table. The firelight made the green of her skin deeper, almost the color of wet moss. Her eyes were calm, but there was something careful in the way she held herself, as if she had been preparing the question for days. "At first," I said. "Yes." She lowered her gaze to the table. I saw her shoulders tighten slightly, the way they had the first evening when she had looked around the house and said nothing. I went on before she could answer. The woman in the letters would have been easier. She would have known exactly how much salt to put in the soup, and she would never have cried on the porch the first night. She would have made the days run more smoothly. Maelra was quiet. Outside, the wind found a new crack and whistled through it. "But she would not have made the house feel larger than it is," I said. "She would not have read poems about stones that remember names while the snow piles against the door. She would not have stayed 3 months and still be trying to learn how to keep the bread from going hard in the middle." I rubbed the side of my thumb against the rough edge of the table. "You make the days wider. That is not the same as making them easier." She lifted her head. For several breaths, she simply looked at me, as if she were weighing whether the words were true or only kind. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something close to it. "You are not the farmer I pictured when I answered the first letter," she said. I gave a short laugh. "I know. You wrote that the farm was stable and the life was quiet. You did not write that the roof leaks when the wind comes from the east, or that you sometimes talk to the cattle as if they can answer you. I talk to them because they are better company than most people I have met." This time she did smile, small and real. "You are not elegant. You are not the kind of man who would have been chosen for me in my father's house. But you are more real than any of them." The wind pushed harder against the house. A loose shutter somewhere outside banged once and then settled. We sat without speaking for a long time after that. She opened her book again and began to read, not the old Orcish poems this time, but a quieter piece she had translated for me before. Her voice was lower than usual, almost steady enough to be mistaken for the sound of the fire itself. I listened without looking at her. I watched the way the lamplight moved across the crooked shelf and the mended coats hanging by the door. I thought about the letters we had both written, how carefully we had dressed the truth so it would be accepted. I thought about the nights she had spent learning to make bread that did not burn, and the afternoons I had spent pretending I did not notice how hard she was trying. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the house held the two of us in the small, ordinary warmth we had built between us. There was no declaration, no promise spoken aloud, only the quiet understanding that neither of us was any longer waiting for the other to leave. When she finished reading, she closed the book and set it back on the shelf. She did not move to the other side of the room. She stayed where she was, hands resting on the table, close enough that I could have reached out and covered them with my own if I had chosen to. I did not. Not yet. But for the first time since she had stepped down from the cart, I stopped wondering how long she would stay. The winter was still young. The cold would grow worse before it eased. Yet in that moment, with the wind moving around at the corners of the house and her book resting on the shelf I had made, I felt something settle inside my chest that had been restless for a very long time. We were not the people we had promised each other on paper. We were only ourselves, learning day by day how to remain in the same small space without breaking it. And for now, that was enough. The coldest night of the winter came without warning. The wind had been rising for days, but that evening it settled into a hard, steady howl that drove the temperature down until the water in the bucket outside the door froze solid by midnight. I had checked the cattle twice already and was banking the fire for the last time when I heard the low, uneasy lowing from the barn. I pulled on my coat and took the lantern. The cold hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose with every breath. When I reached the barn and held the light over the stall, I knew at once that something was wrong. The big roan cow, the best milker we had, was on her side and breathing hard. Her flanks were heaving in a way that told me the calf was not coming easily. I set the lantern on the hook and went in. One glance was enough. The calf was turned the wrong way. I could feel the small hooves when I reached inside, but the head was not where it should have been. If I could not turn it, both the cow and the calf would be lost before morning. I worked for a while in silence, trying to shift the small body with my hands. The cow strained and lowed, and the cold bit deeper into my arms with every minute. Sweat ran down my back even as my fingers grew numb. I knew I needed help. Someone to hold the light steady. Someone to keep the cow calm. But the thought of calling her out into this cold and this mess stopped me. She had already learned more than she had ever expected to learn on this farm. This was not the kind of work I had brought her here to do. I told myself I could manage alone. I was still telling myself that when the barn door opened behind me. She stood in the opening, with every coat she owned layered over her shoulders and a second lantern in her hand. Her breath clouded in the air between us. "Do not tell me to go back inside," she said. I straightened, my arms still wet to the elbows. "It is too cold. And this is not—" "I did not come to the border to sit by the fire when there is real work to be done, Mum," she answered. She set her lantern beside mine and came into the stall without waiting for permission. "Tell me what you need." For a moment I only looked at her, then I nodded toward the cow's head. "Keep her steady. Talk to her if you can. I have to turn the calf." She knelt at the cow's shoulder and laid one broad hand on the damp neck. She began to speak in her own language, low and steady, the same way she sometimes read from her book at night. The words meant nothing to me, but the sound of them seemed to reach the animal. The cow's breathing eased a little. I went back to work. The cold made my hands clumsy, and the cow's straining made every movement harder. Twice I thought I had the calf turned only to feel it slip back. My arms ached. The lantern light flickered when the wind found a gap in the boards. She never moved. She stayed where she was, one hand on the cow, the other holding the lantern as still as if it had been nailed in place. I could see her fingers growing stiff around the handle, but she did not complain. Time passed in a long, frozen stretch. I do not know how long I worked inside the cow. My shoulders burned. My fingers had lost most of their feeling. Then at last, I felt the small body shift into the right position. The next contraction came hard. I guided the hoofs forward, and a moment later the calf slid free onto the straw, wet and steaming in the cold air. The cow let out a long, exhausted breath. The calf was small but alive. I cleared its nose and mouth with my fingers and rubbed it roughly with a handful of clean straw until it lifted its head and made a thin, wavering sound. She set the lantern down at last and came to help. Together we got the calf to its feet and guided it toward its mother. The cow turned her head and began to lick it clean. Only then did I realize how badly my hands were shaking. I looked at her. She was still on her knees in the straw, both hands wrapped around the lantern even though she no longer needed to hold it. Her knuckles had gone white. When I touched her fingers, they were rigid with cold. "Let go," I said quietly. She tried. Her hands would not open. I had to work the lantern free from her grip, one finger at a time. Then I took both her hands between mine and brought them to my mouth, breathing warmth onto them. I rubbed them slowly, trying to bring the blood back. She watched me without speaking. Her face was pale from the cold, and there was straw caught in her hair. After a while, she gave a small, tired laugh. "Your letter said the farm was prosperous," she said. I kept rubbing her fingers. "Your letter said you were skilled at household work." "We are both poor liars." I looked at her then, really looked, at the tiredness in her eyes and the way she had not once complained through the whole long hour. "I do not want to change what I wrote," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "Neither do I." The words sat between us in the cold air of the barn. Outside, the wind still howled, but in here the only sounds were the cow's steady breathing and the small wet noises of the calf trying to stand. I had come out here expecting to lose something. Instead, I had gained a truth I had not known how to name before. I leaned forward and pressed my mouth to her forehead. She did not pull away. She only closed her eyes and let her weight rest very slightly against me. Her hands were still between mine, slowly warming. We stayed like that until the calf had nursed and the cow had settled. Then we gathered the lanterns and walked back to the house together through the dark. The sky was just beginning to pale in the east. My arms ached, and my clothes were stiff with dried blood and straw, but for the first time in many years, I did not feel the weight of the winter pressing quite so heavily on my shoulders. She walked beside me without speaking. When we reached the door, she paused and looked back toward the barn, as if making sure the new life we had pulled into the world was still safe. Then she stepped inside. I followed her. The fire had burned low, but the house was still warm. She moved to the stove and began to build it up again, with the same quiet purpose she had shown in the barn. I stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her, and understood that something had changed between us that could not be undone by morning or by spring or by any number of letters left unwritten. We had both come here carrying stories we could not quite live up to. Tonight, we had lived something neither of us had put on paper. And in the space between those two truths, something new had taken root. The spring came slowly that year, as if the land itself needed time to believe the cold was truly over. When the last of the snow had melted and the ground could be worked again, we went to the small stone chapel at the edge of the three-house settlement. It was not a grand ceremony. There were no guests from distant clans or fine clothes sent from any family. We stood before the old priest in the clothes we wore for ordinary days, and we spoke the words that made our marriage real in the eyes of the law and whatever gods still listened to border farmers. She wore a simple dress she had sewn herself during the long evenings of winter. I wore the best shirt she had mended for me. When the priest asked if she came of her own will, she looked at me and answered clearly, "Yes. This time it is not because of any letter." After that, the years moved the way years do on a border farm, quietly at first, then all at once. The 60 acres grew to more than 200. We bought the lower pasture from a man who had grown too old to work it, and later we cleared the stony slope to the west. New fences went up. A second barn rose beside the first. We planted apple trees along the southern edge, and in time they began to bear fruit that was small but sweet. The packed earth floor of the house was replaced, board by board, with proper timber. She insisted on it. I complained about the cost and the work, but in the end I laid every plank myself. The crooked shelf I had made for her book did not stay small. Over the years it became an entire wall of shelves. She wrote letters to old acquaintances and asked for books no longer wanted. I began to read as well, first the practical ones about soil and livestock, then the older stories she loved. One evening, I told a neighbor that I had ordered a wife who could cook and received an entire library instead. She heard me and threw a dishcloth at my head, but she was smiling when she did it. We had 4 children. The first was a girl with her mother's eyes and my stubborn chin. The others came steadily after. She taught them their letters before they could properly hold a hoe. I taught them how to listen to the land and how to finish what they started even when their hands blistered. They grew up with the smell of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of cattle in the yard, and the story of the night. Their father and mother pulled a calf into the world together in the coldest barn on the hill. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the children are grown enough to have their own lives, I still think about the letters we once wrote. She had come expecting a man who knew how to speak gently and move through the world with grace. I had come expecting a woman who already knew how to keep a house from falling into disorder. Neither of us received what we asked for on paper. What we received instead was harder and better. She learned to make bread that did not burn and to read the sky before a storm. I learned to listen when words were read aloud and to understand that a house needs more than walls and a fire to feel like it belongs to someone. We argued sometimes. We worked until our backs ached. We buried animals we had raised and celebrated small harvests that meant we would not go hungry. Through all of it, we stayed. The letters had done their work. They had brought two strangers across a distance neither of us could have crossed alone. But it was the days that followed. The burned meals, the crooked shelf, the long night in the barn, the slow mending of walls and of each other. That kept us here. We had not been the people we claimed to be. We became something truer instead. And on evenings when the wind moves across the fields the way it always has, I sometimes find her standing at the window with one of the old books in her hands. She no longer needs to ask where anything belongs in this house. I no longer wonder how long she will choose to remain. We are no longer the man and woman who met because two letters told kinder versions of the truth. We are simply the ones who stayed,